Hey everyone, Devin here with Backcountry Exposure. Today we're talking about how to choose the right tent for backpacking and take into consideration 5 factors that are an important part of that decision-making process to find the right shelter for the backpacking trips that you're going to go on. Those considerations or factors are the size of the tent, the weight of the tent, the cost or what your budget is, the features that you want and need out of the shelter, and then the environment that you're going to be using that particular shelter in. Very important considerations that will ensure that you get the right product for the experiences that you are trying to have out in the backcountry. Today's video is sponsored by BACKCOUNTRY.com. If you are shopping on Backcountry, these are all things that you can use within their filter list to narrow down exactly the options that would fit into those considerations for choosing a backpacking tent. Many options available from 4-season, 3-season, non-freestanding, freestanding shelters. It's all there. And better yet, if you need help figuring out exactly what to purchase based off of these considerations, start to chat with their gearheads and ask your question. They are going to be able to narrow down exactly what's going to be the best option for you. And the best thing about it, talking with the gearheads, is free. You don't have to pay anything to get good advice and answers to your questions. And if you're shopping on Backcountry, you can save up to 15% by using my coupon code BACKCOUNTRYEXPOSURE. Some exclusions do apply, but it's a great way to save a few dollars, so might as well give it a shot. Thanks to Backcountry for sponsoring this video today. So let's talk about consideration and factor number 1, and that is size of the shelter that you need. Well, most people are going to go with a 2-person tent because it provides enough space for one person and gear to comfortably be in the shelter, be protected, and not feel super crammed, especially if you're waiting out a storm. A 1-person shelter like this non-freestanding tent that I've got behind me here, this is going to be more appropriate for somebody looking to save a bunch of weight in their system, as well as maybe spending longer days on the trail and really just setting up the tent at night and trying to have a dry, warm, comfortable place to sleep. And so this is a great option, but it really just comes down to personal preference. What do you want out of the space of the shelter? If you're going with 2 people, then you can go with a larger tent. You can split the weight of that shelter, and that is a benefit in purchasing that type of shelter as well. So size is important when making a consideration, but most people are going to go with something about this size if it's the only tent that you're going to be using for backpacking. Now, the next really important consideration when it comes to choosing a tent is the weight of the shelter. This is something that you can get into a massive rabbit hole on, and honestly, at the end of the day, it probably doesn't really matter because the way that fabrics and technology with fabrics and tent designs now, you're pretty much always going to be under 4 pounds in total weight. But are you somebody that wants sub 2 pounds in weight for your shelter? And if that's the case, a non-freestanding shelter like this is probably going to be what you're looking at as opposed to a freestanding option like this Fly Creek here, because pole structure and everything adds additional weight to the overall shelter weight and is going to be more in that 2.5 to 3 pound range. Well, it just, again, comes down to what is your preference? What are you trying to accomplish with your backpacking system? Are you trying to go ultra light? And if so, then yes, saving as much weight as possible is very important. Otherwise, that 3 to even 4 pound range is going to put you into a great shelter that's going to perform well in weather conditions, as well as probably isn't going to break the bank as much as something that is really ultralight focused, especially if it's made out of a Dyneema composite fabric material. And so, yeah, it really just comes down to what you're trying to accomplish out of it. But weight is important, and most of the time you can spend about $300 to $400 in price for a shelter, and you're going to get something that is sub 3 pounds in weight. So that segues into the next factor, or factor number 3, and that is cost. What's your budget? How much are you able to spend, or are you willing to spend on a backpacking shelter? Well, that's up to you. You can spend as much as $1,000 for a Big Agnes Dyneema composite fabric tent, and cool, that's great. You could also spend $150 for something that is made out of a heavier material. It still isn't going to be crazy heavy, but it's still going to perform well, and it really just depends what your budget is. How much are you willing to spend? A lot of times, you're going to end up spending about $300 to $400 for a backpacking shelter from the bigger name brands like Big Agnes or Sierra Designs or MSR, that kind of thing, or Nemo. This is going to be kind of like the standard for cost when it comes to a lightweight and very well performing backpacking shelter. So what's your budget? What are you trying to accomplish? And as you're searching online and such for different options, you'll be able to filter out. I only have $250 to spend, and that's going to give you all of the different options available in that realm for what you're trying to accomplish with your budget. Whew, let's get out of that wind here for a second and talk about the next factor, factor number 4, which is the features that you want out of the shelter that you're going to purchase. I'm going to break this up into 2 subcategories of necessary features and luxury features. Now let's talk about necessary features first. What I mean by that is the absolute necessary things that are going to ensure that the tent performs in the conditions and the environment that you're going to be using it in. We're going to talk more about environment here in a second, but I'm going to use this Fly Creek here, for example. On a recent trip, I took this shelter out and had a gnarly windstorm. And basically what ended up happening is this shelter does not have enough structure to hold itself up and keep it from collapsing and creating basically losing its integrity and not performing the way that it should when in super high winds. And so this is not the ideal shelter when you find yourself in scenarios that are going to be very, very windy. Now, there are ways that you can pitch a shelter to adjust how the wind comes over the pole structure, but it doesn't guarantee that it's going to perform super great. And what can happen in those kinds of scenarios is broken poles, stakes ripping out and such that can create a miserable experience and create dangerous situations when you're out in the backcountry. So necessary features that fit and match the conditions that you're going to be experiencing when you're out on your backpacking trips. Other necessary types of features could be like, does it need to be a front entry like this as a solo person? Or is it 2 doors and because you've got 2 people with you? Or do you need a higher hydrostatic head out of the Rainfly for a higher waterproof rating because you're in a very rainy type of environment? Those are all important things to consider. Now, luxury type of features may come down to like, oh, how much storage options and pockets and stuff do I have inside of the tent? Or do I have a huge vestibule space? Or how much height do I have out of the tent? When it comes to like a solo shelter over here, do I have the ability to pitch it in different types of ways? Or I'm looking for a single wall shelter versus a double wall shelter, or freestanding versus non-freestanding. All of those aspects are feature sets that are an important part of considering exactly what I need out of a backpacking shelter. Now, the last thing to consider is the environment and the season that you're going to be using the shelter in. We've already talked about that a little bit with the feature aspect, but more importantly is you've got to purchase a tent that is going to work in the environment that you're using it in. Here in the desert for me, I'm going to use more or less a freestanding tent most of the time when I'm in the true desert, on slick rock, in the sand, that kind of scenario, because it's going to provide a better pitch. I'm going to get a tighter pitch. I'm going to get a better experience out of that shelter as opposed to using a non-freestanding tent like this one over here, because it requires a lot of tension on the stakes for it to pitch correctly. So I've got to consider the environment that I'm using the shelter in. Yes, this tent weighs less than this one that I'm sitting in here right now, but it doesn't fit and check that box for environment in majority of the places that I go. So I go with a freestanding shelter like this in those kinds of scenarios. The other factor is considering 4-season versus 3-season. Do I have a shelter that I want to go out and use in the wintertime? Is it going to handle snow load? Is it going to handle extreme temperature changes? That's a big part of 4-season backpacking. This particular shelter here, ultra lightweight, 3-season specific. It is not going to perform well in those 4-season cold weather scenarios. Another factor that we talked about a little bit is single wall versus double wall. If you're in an environment that is high humidity and it's a very wet environment, a double wall shelter like both of these are here today, they are going to be better options to help reduce the amount of condensation that can transfer from the walls of the tent to your gear inside of the tent. It doesn't matter if it's double wall or single wall, you're still going to get condensation. The double wall just helps reduce the amount of contact that your sleeping bag, most importantly, is going to have the ability to make any contact with the sidewall of the tent. So you can save a bunch of weight in your backpacking tent, in your system, by going with a single wall, but it may not always be the best option depending on what kind of conditions and environment you are going to be backpacking in at the time. Now, it's impossible for me to cover every single aspect when it comes down to the considerations of choosing a backpacking shelter. But this at least gives you a high-level, full umbrella of things to consider when trying to decide which tent makes the most sense for me to purchase for the backpacking trips that I go on. If you're like me, you're going to end up with many different options that fit different types of styles of trips that you're going to be going on. But if you were to buy only one shelter ever, I would probably suggest going with a freestanding shelter that is a 2-person, that's going to give you plenty of room, that you could share with somebody on the trips that you end up going with multiple people. It would be just a great option. But again, impossible for me to say this is the best tent, this is the only option. So many different considerations. But I appreciate you guys watching today. Would love to have a conversation in the comments with you about this and how you came to a decision on which tent made the most sense for you, and maybe what shelter you are currently using on your backpacking trips. I appreciate you guys watching. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe. Thanks to Backcountry for sponsoring this video. Hope you guys have an awesome day. Catch you on the next one. See you later.